Hi, hello, welcome. My name is Leah, and I'm the designer behind Charlie Darwin Textiles. I'm also the person who, technically put together this sewing pattern and the instructions and the illustrations and all of it. So obviously, I'm very excited to finally get it into your hands, and I'm just so excited to have you here. So if you're watching this video right now, it means that you've already gotten your hands on the Finch top sewing pattern, and I just want to say great choice. Honestly, this is one of those projects that I think has just the right amount of challenge to keep it kind of fun and fresh for you, and a lot of places where you can infuse personalization, kind of like custom ruffles, different sleeve types. There are, I think, like 21 different ways you could mix and match just like the core design features between 7 types of sleeves and 3 collars, and then all the pieces you could add ruffles. That adds up to even more. Okay, I'm rambling, but honestly, this is an endlessly remixable pattern. I think you already know that though. In this video here, I want to walk you through a few key things. First, we're going to go through all of the different design features so that you can see them. You can know what's coming, like where are the seams on this bodice, and what will you be turning a 2D thing into a 3D thing. How are you going to do that? I'm going to give you an overview of the design and the different design variations and even more pattern hacks that you could do. And then I'm going to show you which pattern pieces you'll need, and then we'll jump right into the sew along sewing tutorial step by step. Now, that's all that's in this video, but you should grab the sewing pattern instructions. That is going to tell you tons of really important, helpful information and video links about, let's say, what tools and fabrics and sewing notions that I recommend for this project. Plus, I'll give you guides on how to take your body measurements correctly and choose your right size. I'll show you how to make a height adjustment with my height adjustment calculator, and I will also show you fabric cutting layouts, all that good stuff. There's a sewing terms glossary, there's a pattern notes worksheet. It's full of good stuff that's all there to help you, not confuse you. So check those pattern instructions out for sure alongside with this video. And if you ever run into any issues that aren't covered in this video or in your sewing pattern instructions, then absolutely feel free to email me at leah@charliedarwintextiles.com, and I'll try my very best to help you get through the struggle. As far as the sew along portion of this video goes, you can sew along with me in real time, just sort of step by step, and I section this video into chapters so that you can easily navigate to whichever step you're working on specifically, and also skip steps for like sleeve variations that you aren't even doing. Or you could put this video on double speed and watch the whole thing through really fast, and I'll sound like a chipmunk, and that way you can just kind of see like an overview of the entire project being done before you start. Some people find that really helpful as well. It's totally whatever works for you and your sewing and learning style. And on that note, I kind of want to do like a mindset check-in before I begin. I just want to put this out into your universe that there's no one right way to do this sewing project to complete the Finch top. And I mean that in like big and small ways. Like on the micro level, I gave you way too many options to decide from for how you're going to design like what pieces you're going to use for this pattern, whether you're going to do the bell sleeve or the band collar, or blah, blah, blah. Don't worry about it. All roads lead to greatness is what I'm trying to say here. There's no wrong design variation in my book. I think they're all super cute. So just choose boldly, and you can always pivot as you go. If you're halfway through and you hate the sleeve you chose, just seam rip it off and choose a different sleeve. Or if you make the whole thing and you're like, this is cool for these occasions, then you need to make another one for other occasions. Anyway, the point is, don't get bogged down in the design decisions. There's no one right way to do this. And in the bigger picture of sewing, sewing is not just a skill, but it's an adventure. And you are allowed to go at your own pace and make weird mistakes. And if you do, then I just recommend you take a break, drink some water, eat a snack, come back. We can all laugh at it. That's not failure. That's just like a part of the process, and we all go through it. Just come back, laugh it off, shake it off, and keep going. I promise you've got this, and by the end, you'll have a really cool top that you're so proud of that you made with your own two hands. And I think that's just such a satisfying, confidence-boosting feeling. Honestly, it's like a high I am chasing all the time. It's just making cool things with my hands and getting to those ending stages where it's all getting finished up and you put it on and you're like, yes, this is so cool. I'm so proud of myself. Hence why I do it as a business. But honestly, it's going to feel so good. I believe in you. You got this. And please, please, we, as a Charlie Darwin community, other people who sew with my patterns, we would love to see what you make. If you would please upload a picture of your final creation onto the Finch Sewing Pattern Gallery. I'll try and link to it in this video and then also like in emails I send to you about the pattern. Hopefully you can find the link somewhere, but this is a super safe space where you can just upload a picture of what you created. You could be wearing it, you don't have to be, and just give us some notes about what did you change on it, how did it feel for your body type, were there any cool adjustments or like fun pattern hacks you did, what fabrics did you use? We would all love to see it, and then you can also go to that photo gallery and get ideas for your creation as well. You might see some notes that really inspire you. So pay back that favor and add some photos of yourself and your garment. We would love to see it. At the time of making this video, when you fill out that form, you also get a discount code for your next sewing pattern from me, so could be worth it. All right, you got this. Let's do it. We're going to jump right into choosing our design elements. All right, so you've got your pattern and you're trying to decide what variations do you want to make, what do you want to put together. You have so many options, right? Okay, so let me walk through what's going on this garment so you know a little bit better where you can swap things in and out, what you could add, and what cool hacks you might be able to do. So I'm going to go top to bottom. Starting up here at the collar, we have 3 different variations that you could choose from. You have a band collar, which is what you have right here, and on my shirt. And then there's also the traditional collar, which is going to use the same collar stand piece, plus have the traditional pointy collar piece. And then I also included instructions for a Peter Pan collar, which will lie more flat down on the chest of the garment. So for the band collar and the Peter Pan collar, I include instructions and a specific pattern piece that will show you how to make these little ruffles that stick out of the seam of the collar. This is also a place where if you've seen my videos on using selvage edge in your seams, that could look really cute right here as well, instead of doing a ruffle if you want more of a faux fray look. Now, moving down from our collar, which this is a pretty, if you have it buttoned all the way up, it will touch your neck, I would guess. We all have different necks, but this will touch your neck all the way around. And you can choose whether you want to put a button on your collar or not for the collar stand on the band with the traditional collar. I did do a button on here. I will say adding a button to the collar stand is a little bit more challenging. It's a smaller area to work with. It can be really cute if you're someone who likes to button shirts all the way up, which I really love to do. You can add that button there. Otherwise, you could do buttons just on this placket part. You could do snaps in any of these places. And I've also had a couple people say that they know they're never going to button this shirt up. They don't even care. They just skipped the buttons entirely and just wore it totally open, which I can show you right now. That's what that looks like. Just real relaxed and kind of breezy right there on the neckline. I used 1/2-inch buttons, but you could always use bigger or smaller buttons or any assortment that you have. that is totally up to you. And you'll see in the pattern, the spacing of the buttons is totally up to you as well. All right, then moving down, we have this really cool long seam line that goes across the bust that goes all the way from sleeve hem to sleeve hem. And this is where our gathering is coming out of for the lower bust, for the lower bodice portion. And for any of the sleeve variations, this sleeve line is going to end right here, and all of the sleeve attachments start at this point. So if you're doing a special sleeve, a 3/4 sleeve, long sleeve, bell, bishop, double ruffle, ruffle, tiered, the 2-tier one, any of those, they're all going to be attached right here, and this long bust line seam ends here. So just so you know, that's where we're going to be attaching cool sleeves like these. This is the double ruffle that I'm wearing right now. But before we get into sleeves, let's just talk real quick about this bust line. It is technically another place that you could add these little ruffle details or the selvage edge, like a little bit extra texture popping out of that seam. I know you already get this texture here falling down on the lower bodice portion, but one option is to create a really long piece of ruffling that goes all the way across, or even just like in a section of it, and have that also peeking out of this seam. I don't have instructions for that, but once you see how to do the collar ruffles, I think you'll understand pretty well how to apply it to a seam like the bust line. And I also do show in the instructions, if you have fabric that you like the wrong side of, like maybe it's the same on the front and back, but you don't mind the back side, you could fold your button placket back the other way and actually add ruffles into that seam as well. So there's so many places to add texture. Now let's talk real quick about the sleeve variations. There's 7 variations. You have the short sleeve, which is on the mannequin right now. And then I also have an extension for 3/4 lengths and long sleeve. Those are just going to be like a straight sleeve that kind of taper in towards your wrist. And then we have the ruffle sleeve. We have a double ruffle sleeve, which you can see on mine right here. And a lot of these sleeves also have areas where you could add in little extra personalized details. Like on mine right here on the double ruffle, I turned the seam towards the visible side, and I'm in the process, it's not done, but I'm adding in this applique, and I'm going to hand stitch this little triangle pattern kind of to my garment. I haven't hand stitched it yet, but I'm excited about where it's going. I just tucked it right into that seam. That's another spot where you could add even more ruffles or selvage edge or embroidery. There's like so many options. It's so exciting. Don't get overwhelmed. There is no wrong path. We discussed this. But let's get back to our sleeve concept. You've got ruffle, double ruffle, bishop. And the bishop sleeve, it billows out, and then it has a bias binding around the wrist. And that bias binding is hopefully big enough that you should be able to get your hand in and out of it. It doesn't have any elastic or special ties on it or anything. It's just a hole that's big enough for your hand to fit through, but small enough to kind of like cinch the fabric back in at the wrist after it billows out. I think those are the main points of all of our sleeve variations that I can tell you about. Let's move down through the rest of our garment. We have our bodice piece down here that is going to be gathered up. And you'll see in the instructions, it is not gathered all the way over to the sleeve hem over here. The gathering actually ends right here on the bust line so that it's just in the bust area and not adding extra fabric to your armpit area. So I'll show you how to do that to just gather in this area, but that adds a good amount of fullness right here, which is where all that really nice like braless comfort or ugly bra comfort comes in right here. And then as far as the length of the bodice, it is designed to be worn with high-waisted pants. That's what I typically wear, and so that's what I designed it to be. I like to wear my pants up like a little bit above my belly button. The ones I'm wearing right now, I think land right above my belly button, and I can still tuck in just the front of this shirt pretty well. Too long, and I find that the fabric is hard to tuck into anything because you get too much fabric and then it makes weird issues in your pants. You know what I mean? So I thought this was just the right length. Of course, I adjusted the pattern to not be for me, but for average height, 64 inches. And so it's the right length for a 64-inch tall person. If you are not 64 inches tall, you're going to use my height adjustment calculator to figure out how much to add or subtract from this bodice piece right here. And also, you might do a little bit of adjustments to your sleeve as well. So the bodice is long enough to be free-flowing or tucked into shorts if you're wearing high-waisted shorts. If you're someone who prefers just like a longer tunic, you think you're never going to really tuck it in, you could go with, I think, an extra couple inches, or I've even heard some people say they want to try and turn this into a dress. That was not in my brain power for this pattern launch, but I think it would be really cool if you want to try adding maybe like more tiers to it, like a kind of like my gypsy moth dress that has a tiered skirt. That could be a cool element, or just let it fall straight down on even longer. Or you could go extra crop top and go with something like this if you're feeling like, you want something a little bit easy breezy in the midriff. That's totally up to you. Now, let's take a look at the back of the bodice. We again have the long seam line going from sleeve hem to sleeve hem, and the gathering is just in the back region. It doesn't continue onto our sleeves at all. The gathering here is a little bit less than it is on the front, because typically for women in the front, there's a little bit more boob action going on, and you need that extra fullness. And the amount that it is in the back is just enough to sort of give you breathing room to be able to, do your big bear hugs and everything like that, but not too overly dramatic. Because I know in trialing this shirt, I had a little bit more fullness in the back, and then when I tried it on, it gave me like big back poof energy when I had it tucked in. And with someone with like a small bust, back poof energy can feel kind of too big, too big for me. So I narrowed it down just a little bit with just enough gathering. And then the instructions, I talk about how I'm using a serger to finish my seams, but there are so many ways that you could finish out. You could use zigzag stitch. Some sewing machines have like a faux overlock stitch setting on them. And you could also do French seams. You could do felled seams. There's a lot of options. Check them out. There's so much content on YouTube about how to do different seam types, so I won't bore you with it here. I believe in you. You got this. No decision is the wrong one. I know there's a lot to choose from here, but they're all paths lead to a cute shirt. Price.
All right, let's start by taking a look at all of the different pattern pieces that we want cut out before we begin. There are so many different variations to this pattern, so I'll show you the core pieces and then I'll show you the little special pieces for each of the different variations. So to start out, for everyone who's making this shirt, you're going to have your bodice back upper piece. You're going to be cutting one on the fold. Make sure to mark the notches where this piece is going to match up with our bodice back lower piece. Then we have our two bodice front upper pieces. We're going to cut them mirrored. Just make sure that you've marked your notches right here so you know where to line it up with your bodice front. And if you're doing the Peter Pan collar, you also want to mark the notches that indicate where the center front of the bodice is. We have our bodice front piece that you're going to cut one on the fold, and you want to make sure that you have marked your two notches up here where it's going to meet the bodice front upper. And then we have our bodice back piece. Again, we're going to cut one on the fold, and we are going to mark our two notches up here where it's going to meet up with our bodice back upper. All right, now let's talk about first our different collars that we could make. If you're doing the band collar, you're just going to cut out 2 collar stand pieces. If you're going to be making the traditional collar, then you're going to cut out 2 collar stand pieces plus 2 collar pieces. If you're doing the Peter Pan collar, there's 2 more variations that you could choose from. You could either just do a plain Peter Pan collar or a Peter Pan collar with little ruffles around the edge. If you're going to be doing the one with ruffles around the edge, then you'll be cutting out 2 of the Peter Pan collar upper, and you're going to be cutting out a really long ruffle strip using the ruffle strip piece in the pattern and doubling it. My fabric wasn't quite long enough, and so I cut out 2, and I'm just going to put a seam right here to connect them. Now, if you are doing a Peter Pan collar with no ruffles, then you're going to be using 1 of the Peter Pan upper and 1 of the Peter Pan under. The Peter Pan under, it's very close in size, but it's just like 1/8 of an inch smaller around the edge. And that's gonna help it so that when we do a seam around this whole edge, it'll sort of tuck under and hide on the underside of the collar. All right, now let's get into our different sleeve variations. So if you're doing short sleeve, then you need no additional pieces other than just our bodice pieces we already cut out. Now for all of the special sleeve variations, I'm going to be showing them to you with just like a thrifted bed sheet fabric, but it'll look a little bit different than the main garment in color. And I'm only going to show you how to sew 1 arm of each of the design variations. So bear with me. We're going to have 2 of this long sleeve or 3/4 length sleeve pieces. You want to cut them mirrored and make sure that you mark the notch for the shoulder and your front and your back. You could be doing a tiered bell sleeve, in which case you're going to cut out 2 of tier 1 rectangle and 2 of the tier 2 rectangle. You could do a ruffle sleeve, in which case you're just going to need 2 of the ruffle rectangles. You could be doing a double ruffle sleeve, in which case you're going to need 2 of the double ruffle rectangles. And you might be confused about why we don't need 4 pieces here, and it's because the technique we're going to use is going to involve actually just folding this down and gathering it up here, and it's going to give us 2 layers of ruffle from 1 pattern piece. What that also means is that you only want to do the double ruffle variation if you like the back side of your fabric, because we are going to be showing the wrong side and the right side of the fabric in the double ruffle because we're folding it over. So if you don't like the back side, underside, wrong side of your fabric, you probably shouldn't choose the double ruffle variation. And last but not least, if you're doing the bishop sleeve, then you're going to cut out 2 of the bishop sleeve rectangles, and you'll also cut out 2 of the bishop sleeve binding smaller rectangles. For my project today, I'm going to be using 100% linen fabric. So I'm going to be mixing and matching, which is a fun thing you can do with this pattern. It's got lots of good seams that you could do some color blocking with. I'm going to be breaking it up between the bodice upper and lower portions. I'm using a really pretty floral woven linen for the upper. It's different on both sides, so I'm gonna have to make the decision of if I want the dark side or the light side to be right side up. I think I'm gonna go with the light side. And then on my lower portion of my bodice, I'm going to be using a medium weight linen that's just a solid color, an off-white, has good flow and is pre-softened. But you're welcome to use any woven non-stretch fabrics. I don't recommend anything with spandex or stretch to it. That is going to change the way that this sews up and the shape and feel of it. Our first step that we're going to do before we even start constructing the garment is to stay stitch our necklines. This is going to help make sure that our fabric around these curves doesn't stretch out and warp as we put the garment together, because we want it to keep this shape as much as possible so that when we go to attach our collar, it fits perfectly. So I'm going to take these over to my sewing machine and I'm going to stitch 1/4 inch from the raw edge, back stitch at each end. It's just going through the single ply of fabric, but that stitching will help sort of keep everything from pulling apart. It's generally best practice to do your stay stitching from the shoulder in towards the center of the bodice. One more step I'm going to take to prepare, because I'm using this woven linen that's a little bit like extra prone to fraying and wiggling. I want to reinforce the spot where my buttons and buttonholes are going to go. So I'm going to use a lightweight fusible interfacing about 2 inches wide by the length of this area right here. And I'm just going to apply it to the wrong side of my fabric. I've got all my raw edges aligned here. I've got the glue dots facing down towards the fabric, and I'm just gonna press it with my iron on high heat using lots of steam to get it fused on there. That's great. And I'm going to repeat that over on my other bodice piece. Now we're ready to put the garment together. The first seam we're going to do is our shoulder seams. So right now I have all 3 of my bodice upper pieces, like my bodice back upper, my bodice front uppers, and I'm going to place the bodice front upper pieces right sides facing with my bodice back upper piece, and we're aligning it all up here where our shoulder seam is going to be, getting those raw edges even. Then I'll come through and pin everything in place, and we'll take this over to our sewing machine and stitch along that shoulder line with 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at each end. Then we want to finish that raw edge somehow. Now, you totally can choose however you want to finish your edges today. You just want something that's going to keep them from unraveling over time. So if you have a serger, that's fantastic. That's what I'm going to be using today. If you don't have a serger though, there's lots of other options. Most simply, you can do a zigzag stitch along that raw edge, or if you have sort of like a faux overlock serger stitch on your regular sewing machine, you can try that out as well. Because we're doing 1/2 inch seam allowance, my serger is naturally going to cut off about 1/4 inch of fabric as we go along, and that's going to help keep these seams from feeling so bulky up against the body. If you're using your sewing machine with a zigzag stitch or a faux overlock stitch, after you sew your straight stitch, you might consider trimming down your seam allowance to about 1/4 inch and then doing your zigzag or your faux overlock stitch. You could also, of course, do French seams or felled seams, whatever's in your sewing practice today. Here's what that seam looks like finished. Now to add a little bit more of a crisp professional look to our shoulder seams here, we're going to turn our bodice uppers right sides facing up, and we're going to press the seam we just made, that seam allowance, toward the bodice back upper. So I'm just going to use my fingers to sort of press the seam allowance in that direction, and then come in with my iron, push it and press it real well towards the back. Now I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch through that bodice back upper and the seam allowance about 1/8 inch from that original seam line, back stitching at each end. Here's what that seam looks like finished. It's a great practice after every seams that you make that you come around with your scissors and trim up any loose thread tails, just so that they don't start getting all bundled and bunched up on you as we move through the project. All right, if you are someone who is making the Peter Pan collar, then you're going to want to skip ahead to step number 3 at this point. The rest of us who are doing the traditional and band collar are going to be working on our front button plackets right here, but you're going to want to assemble your collar first if you're doing the Peter Pan, and then come and do these plackets. For those of us who are going to be doing the band collar or the traditional collar, then we're going to proceed with working on our button plackets right here for our center front. So I don't know why a placket is called a placket, but it is the technical term for the spot where the buttons are going to go. So we have a couple options of how we could do our button placket. If you are someone who wants to add a little bit of an extra ruffle detail here at our button placket, then you're going to want to be turning your fabric towards the right side of the fabric when we do our turns. So that way your seam line that you're going to make is going to show up here, and that's where you can insert ruffles. I'm not going to be putting ruffles there today. So for the rest of us, we're going to flip our garment over to the wrong side. So the wrong side is facing up, and in the center midline area of our upper bodice front, we're going to turn that raw edge there under by 1/2 inch to start. Then we'll fold it again by 1 1/8 inch in the same direction. Pull out our ruler just to double check and press that in place. Press it real nice. And then we'll come in with our pins and just pin it every few inches. We're gonna repeat that over on the other side over here. And then we're gonna take both over to our sewing machine, and we're going to sew just 1/8 inch away from that inner fold right there, back stitching at each end. Here's how that seam looks finished on the right side of the garment, and here's how it looks finished on the wrong side. All right, now we're ready to do our collar of choice. So we have 4 options actually. So I'm gonna work through all 4 of them right now. You can skip ahead to the part of the video that has your collar variation, or just check out all 4. But we're gonna go ahead and start with the band collar, and I'm going to show you how I do ruffles in mine. And you can choose to do ruffles or like a strip of the selvage edge of your fabric to incorporate a little extra texture here, or just keep it simple and don't add anything. If you'll be integrating a ruffle into this collar, I'll show you how to do that right now. So we have our long ruffle strip, and we're going to start with the wrong sides facing up. We're gonna fold in the little short ends over here. We're just going to fold those in by about 1/4 inch. So we're folding those to the wrong side and pressing. And then we're gonna go ahead and fold the entire long strip in half lengthwise all the way down. So now wrong sides of the fabric are facing each other inside that fold. And now we're going to take this over to our sewing machine, and we're going to do a gathering stitch. So we're gonna set our stitch length to your longest stitch length, and we're gonna stitch all the way from one end down to the other one. We're gonna back stitch at the first end, but we're not going to back stitch at the second end. Instead, we wanna leave a tail of threads that's about 6 inches long so that we can pull and gather our stitches. We're gonna do this stitch twice. We're gonna do one that is 1/8 of an inch away from the raw edge, and then we're gonna do a second one that's about 1/4 of an inch away from the raw edge. All right, here's what that seam looks like finished. We've got back stitching over here, and we've got our loose threads over here. And I'm going to go ahead and start gathering these threads. And we're gonna go ahead and grab the 2 threads that are kind of on the top side for us here, and we're going to pull gently, kind of holding the fabric and pushing that gathering along as we go. There's going to be a little bit of resistance here because you're dealing with 2 layers of fabric trying to gather these ruffles, and so this is going to feel a little bit tighter or more difficult to push these ruffles along than it usually does when you're ruffling just a single piece of fabric. But try your best to bear with it. You want to pull just gently enough that you're not breaking your threads, but it is going to take a little bit of finagling to push that gathering all the way through. On your collar stand, you should have marked 2 notches, and that is where we are going to put our ruffle in between. So we want to pull those gathering stitches on our ruffle strip until it's made it so that the raw edge of our ruffle strip is approximately the length between the 2 notches, and mine's looking pretty close. So I'm just going to kind of move around my ruffles a little bit so that they are more evenly spaced, and they might kind of twist around on you a little bit. That's all right. You can always come in with your iron and squish them, flatten them out, get them nice and flat and orderly. And what we want to do to start is grab just one of our collar stand pieces, and we're going to place our ruffle strip in between our notches. get those raw edges all lined up of the ruffle strip and the top edge of our collar stand, and we'll pin that in place. Now we'll take this over to the sewing machine, and just to hold this ruffle piece in place before we construct our full collar here, we're going to run a straight stitch over and through all of our ruffles and the collar stand, all the way from one end to the other with about a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So this is gonna fall somewhere between like a 1/4 inch and a 1/2 inch. You'll send it through your sewing machine with the ruffle side up. You don't wanna put the ruffles down into the sewing machine or they might kind of get stuck in your feed dogs. Go ahead and backstitch at both ends. Here's what that seam looks like finished. Now we're ready to assemble our full band collar. All right, here's where you want to tune in if you are just doing the regular band collar with no ruffles. I know you see ruffles here, but don't let that confuse you. You're just going to follow the same steps at this point as someone who did the ruffles. So you have your 2 band collar pieces, and we're going to take one of them and we're going to have it wrong side facing up, and we're going to fold the long raw edge of it up toward the wrong side by 1/2 inch and press that in place. And I say 1/2 inch, but to be safe, you probably want to do more like 3/8 inch, just a little short of a 1/2 inch. Now we're going to take this band collar piece and we're going to place it right sides facing with our other band collar piece. And if you have done the ruffles, then your ruffles should be facing up as well. You're just gonna sandwich those ruffles in there. So we got our band collar pieces. I'm gonna place them right sides facing, and I'm gonna line up the curved upper edge of that band collar. So it's not gonna reach right here, it's just gonna match up that curved upper edge. And I like to kind of align everything, press it with my iron real quick just to make sure everything is kind of sticking together, and then we'll come around with our pins and pin everything in place. Now we'll take this over to our sewing machine and we're going to stitch from the bottom corner here around that curve, along the straight top edge, around that corner, and down to this bottom edge on the other side. We're going to do a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at each end. Here's what that seam looks like finished. Now we're ready to trim that seam down to 1/8 of an inch. So all the way around this curve, I'm going to use my scissors and just trim off the excess. You're gonna have some good sharp scissors to get through all your layers of your ruffle and your band collar if you did the ruffle, but make your way through. All right, here's what that cut looks like. Now we're gonna turn our collar right side out, and you can see my little ruffles are peeking out and finally saying hello. Very exciting. And I am going to press my collar so that no fabric is like stuck in that seam. There's gonna be fabric that wants to kind of get sucked into it, and it's your job with your iron to come around and make sure that everything's lying flat. Now, especially when I turn it around, more fabric has gotten sucked into that seam on the back, and I want to make sure that I've got the entirety of my collar stand flat outside of it. All right, in the process we kind of lost my fold here, but I can still see it, so I'm going to reset it with my iron. Tuck that under where it used to be tucked under and press. All right, and here is what we're looking at. Of course, if you didn't do the ruffle, your collar stand will still just look just like this, no ruffle. And now we have assembled our band collar with or without ruffles, and we are ready to attach it to the neckline. All right, in this section of the video, I'm going to show you how to sew the traditional collar. We're gonna start with just our 2 collar pieces. These are our more pointy ones, and we are going to place them on top of each other with right sides facing. Get all of our edges lined up, and then we're going to pin just around 3 edges, the 2 sides and our long curved top edge. Leave this part unpinned. Now we're going to take this over to our sewing machine and we are going to sew those same 3 edges with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at each end. Here's what that seam looks like finished. Now we're going to trim that seam allowance down to about 1/8 inch. So I'm just going to go around those 3 sides, do a little bit of a diagonal clip right at that corner seam, just making sure you're never cutting into or really too close to your seam, but we want to get a lot of this bulk out of here. Now we're ready to turn our collar right side out. So I'm going to flip it, and then I like to take a pointy but kind of still blunt object, something like a mechanical pencil that doesn't have the lead out, and use it to poke out those corners of our collar to get them nice and pointy. Something too pointy might kind of rip through your seam that you've created there. We don't want that, but we want something just good enough that we can get into that little nook and get it as pointy as we possibly can. Go over to my other side, repeat over there. All right, then I want to get this collar lying really flat. So I'm going to come in with my iron and I'm going to use my fingers to sort of roll out all those seams. On a seam like this, your fabric wants to get sort of sucked into that seam line right there. And it's your job to come in and sort of use your fingers to roll all of the fabric out of that seam so it's not getting sucked in, and squish it with your iron to get a nice crisp edge. All right, so here's how our collar is looking so far. Now we're ready to squish it inside of our collar stand pieces. So we're gonna bring these guys into play, and I am going to take one of my collar stand pieces and place it right sides facing up. I'm going to take my other one wrong side facing up, and I'm going to turn its long bottom edge under towards the wrong side. Ouch, too much seam. Towards the wrong side of the fabric by about 3/8 of an inch, almost a 1/2 inch, but not quite. And if you don't have those little notches marked on both of your collar stand pieces, it might be helpful to do that now. We're going to knead them so that we know where to line up our collar on the collar stand. Another thing you can do is fold everything in half and press it so that you know where the midline is of all of your pieces, and you can make sure they're lined up that way as well. So I'm going to take my collar that we've already assembled, and I am going to line its raw edge, unsewn edge, up with the top kind of curved edge of our collar stand, and we're going to line up those midlines, and you can see that the edge of my collar lines up perfectly with that notch there. That's great news. And before I pin anything, I'm going to sandwich that collar in between with my other collar stand piece. So it's going to be wrong side facing up. The right side of it is going to be facing our collar and the other collar stand piece. Then we're going to come in with our pins, and we're going to pin around those 2 little side curves and the long top edge. You're pinning through all 3 layers here, and you're making sure that our fold that we created earlier on the collar stand is still folded up towards the wrong side. And then we're going to take it over to our sewing machine, and we're going to stitch from one bottom corner around and across that top edge of the collar stand and down to the other bottom corner. You are going to make sure that you keep this collar stand folded up in the process, and you're going to kind of tack it into place as you're stitching through it. Go ahead and back stitch at each end. All right, here's what that seam looks like finished. Now we're going to come in with our scissors and trim that seam allowance that we just made down to about 1/8 inch all the way around. And now we're going to fold our collar stand to be right side out. And this is another instance where that seam's gonna really want to suck the fabric back into it, and we wanna try and pull it out and get it as flat as possible. So just go around, get that curve looking nice. Use your fingers to sort of push that fabric out of the seam, press it with your iron, flip it over, do the same thing on the back because it's gonna try and suck the fabric into that seam on that side as well. All right, back to this side, and you can see that with all that ironing, my little 1/2 inch fold on the collar stand came undone a little bit, so I can still see traces of where it used to be. I'm gonna come in with my iron and reset that so that it is folded under by a 1/2 inch still. All right, this is what our traditional collar is looking like, all assembled. Next, we're going to be actually attaching it to our neckline. In this section of the video, I'm going to show you how to assemble a Peter Pan collar with no ruffle around it. So we are going to have our Peter Pan under collar and Peter Pan upper collar piece. And we are also going to have a piece of fusible interfacing cut out in the size of the under collar. I'm going to go ahead and start by just applying that fusible interfacing to the under collar, getting all of my edges lined up. I'm going to apply the fusible interfacing with a very hot, steamy iron, and make sure, double check that the glue dots on your fusible interfacing are facing down into your fabric and not into your iron, or you're going to have a big mess on your hands. I like to just go through, press for about 10 seconds or so, pump some steam on it. And you just want to press down. You're not moving around back and forth. You're just going to a single spot, pressing down for like 6 to 10 seconds, picking it up and moving it over. You want to apply the fusible interfacing to the wrong side of the Peter Pan under collar. All right. I cut out my fusible interfacing kind of sloppily, so I'm just going to clean up those edges real quick that are a little bit bigger than my collar piece. Don't want those sticking to my iron at any point later. All right, here's how that looks with the fusible interfacing fused onto the wrong side of our under collar. Now we're ready to attach our under collar to our upper collar. So we're going to take our upper collar piece and we're going to place it right sides facing with our under collar. And the seam that we are going to stitch around right now is the outer seam. So you have your inner hole here, that's where your neck hole is basically going to go. We are going to completely ignore that inner space right now. We're just going around this outer portion. And your upper collar of your Peter Pan collar should be just a little tiny bit bigger all the way around than your under collar, and that's going to help it so that later the seam that we're making will stay kind of hidden underneath. So for now we're just going to work our way around with pins, aligning those raw edges. And the difference in size in your under collar and your upper collar is just like 1/8 of an inch. So if you didn't cut your fabric out super accurately, which is totally fine, you might not see a huge difference between the under collar and the upper collar. You'll notice that as I have it pinned all the way around, there is a little bit of kind of like bubbling. It's not lying super flat on this inner part. And again, that is just because our under collar is a little bit of a different size, so that's normal. It probably shouldn't be falling super flat right now. Now that we've pinned all the way around, we can take this over to our sewing machine and stitch around from this inner corner here all the way around to that other inner corner with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at each end. Here's what that seam looks like finished. Now we can come in with our scissors and trim that seam allowance down to 1/8 inch all the way around. Here's what that looks like trimmed. Our next step is to turn this collar right side out And the seam is going to try and sort of like suck in the fabric in a way that we don't want it to. And so we're going to try and kind of use our fingers to roll open the seam so no fabric gets trapped in there. And we're also going to be trying to set the fabric so that our seam, very so subtly if possible, can kind of land on the underside of the collar, the side that had the fusible interfacing. And so we are going to come around with our fingers, sort of roll the fabric so that our seam falls underneath and no fabric is trapped inside. And then we're going to come around and press everything really nice and flat with our iron. If your inner edges don't line up insanely perfectly, don't worry too much about it. Close enough is good enough on this. And we are done with constructing our flat Peter Pan collar, no ruffles. Our next step is going to be attaching it to our bodice neckline. In this section of the video, I'm going to show you how to make a Peter Pan collar with ruffles nested into the outer seam here. So we're going to have our two collar upper pieces, and we're going to have a piece of fusible interfacing that is the same size as the collar upper. So we have a couple prep things to do. One thing is we're going to fuse our fusible interfacing to the wrong side of the fabric on one of our collar pieces. Doesn't matter which one because they should theoretically be the same. Try and line up all your raw edges as best you can, and we'll come in with our very hot steamy iron and press for about 6 to 10 seconds on each spot. And you want to just make sure, double, triple check before you're doing this, especially if you're a newbie to fusible interfacing, that the glue dots side is facing down towards your fabric and not up towards your iron, or you're gonna make a big gunky mess out of your iron. As you work your way around, you generally wanna pump some steam into it, and you're doing more of a pressing motion, so just pushing down into the fabric instead of sort of swiping back and forth like you would for ironing. You're instead just going to pick a spot, press down, pick up the iron, press down, pump some steam into it, and keep moving your way all the way around like that. All right, I'm gonna flip this dude over, and I didn't cut my fusible interfacing super precisely, so I'm just going to come around and trim it up a little bit on the overhang around the edges. All right, we'll set that out of the way for now. And we are going to work on our ruffle strips. So our ruffle strips, you could either cut out one really long piece of fabric to go all the way around, or I ended up cutting out two pieces, each half the length of intended. So each one's about the length of just the initial ruffle strip, not cut on the fold, if that makes sense. I think it's going to be easiest for everyone to sew these in, to kind of ruffle them and gather them together as two separate strips instead of one really long one, because this is a little bit more of a difficult, tense gathering process. So if you cut out the really long one, you might consider cutting it into two strips, and we'll conjoin them later after we've gathered them. We're gonna repeat the same process on each strip. What we're gonna do is we are going to turn the short little edge under towards the wrong side of the fabric by about a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch. Repeat that on our other strip. Then we're gonna fold the entire strip in half lengthwise so that the wrong sides of the fabric are facing each other. You want to press this with your iron and repeat over on your other strip. Now we're going to take each strip over to the sewing machine, and we're going to add 2 gathering stitches. What this means is you're going to put your machine on the longest stitch length, and you're going to run a stitch from one end all the way down to the other. You're going to back stitch at the beginning, and you're not going to back stitch at the end. Instead, you're going to leave like a tail of threads that is about 6 inches or so long. We're going to do that stitch 1/4 inch from the raw edge, and then we're going to repeat it 1/8 inch from the raw edge. So 2 parallel stitches. Then we're gonna do the exact same thing over on our second strip. Here's what that seam looks like finished. We've got our back stitching at one end here, and we have our loose thread tails here. We're gonna grab just the top 2 thread tails, the ones that are sort of on the top side of our fabric here, and we're going to start gently pulling them and gathering the fabric. So we're kind of holding on to those 2 thread tails and using our other hand to start moving the fabric down that thread so that it starts to create sort of a ruffle or a gather. Now, this is gonna feel quite tense or difficult to sort of shimmy the fabric down because we've got double layers of fabric happening here and it's kind of a lot going on. So it's gonna take some patience and just finagling, finesse to get these ruffles created. So just be patient, don't pull too hard or you might break those threads, and just start wiggling your way down. Our ultimate goal is to get this ruffle to be the distance from our little inner collar point right here around to the center back of the collar. And so you can see where we're starting, how big we're at, and we need to gather this up to fit right there. Then we're going to do the same gathering technique on our other dude and get him to that length as well. They're going to just sort of casually meet in the middle there. We'll work on that in a little bit. All right, so I gathered my strips up to a distance that I felt like was kind of close, maybe, hopefully, to how long we wanted it. I'm going to go ahead and start checking it to see how close we are. Do we need to let it out a little bit or not? I'm gonna kind of just start pinning it as I go around to test it out. And I'm just pinning it with right sides facing to my collar piece that has the fusible inner facing on it. As I'm starting to kind of lay it out, I think we're gonna be pretty close to midway. Yep, I would say that is very good. So I'm going to work it around with my fingers and pin it just to one single layer, and we're going to be pinning it to the right side as compared to the wrong side of the fabric. As you work your way around, just try and get the gathers to be sort of evenly dispersed, and you also can kind of use your iron to smush them and kind of curve them around as you lay them out. If you're having any issues with them sort of coiling or curling up on you as you're trying to pin them in place, sort of setting them and ironing them as you go can really help keep it organized. So I pinned my first one from this inner point here all the way around to about like our midline center back of our collar, and now I'm just about finished with this second one, and I just want them to meet real nice in the center there. Great. If you have a lot of tangle of threads happening at any juncture, just go ahead and snip those, trim those up right now so they don't get caught up in your final seam. Now we're ready to take this over to our sewing machine, and we're gonna sew around to tack this ruffle to our collar piece. We're gonna sew all the way around with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So this seam allowance is going to be somewhere between the 1/4 inch that we did our gathering stitch at and the 1/2 inch that we're going to actually like attach our collars together with. So that's why we're doing 3/8 inches, and we are going to go all the way around, back stitching at each end. As you put this through your sewing machine, you want to put the ruffle side up, not down into your feedback dogs, but up towards your needle. Here's what that seam looks like finished. Go ahead and trim up any crazy loose threads. I know I have a lot of fray happening on the outer edge of mine. Now we're ready to attach our 2 Peter Pan collar pieces. We are going to take our other piece and we're going to place it right sides facing with the piece that has the ruffle on it, and we're going to be just sandwiching that ruffle in between. So we are going to line up all of our outer curved edges here and pin them in place. It might help to kind of get it lined up and iron it a little first to find our shape. Then we'll take this over to our sewing machine, and with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, we'll stitch from our inner edge here. Now we can come in with our scissors and trim that seam allowance down to 1/8 inch all the way around. You're going to need some good, strong, sharp scissors at this stage to get through all these layers. Here's what that looks like trimmed. And now we're ready to flip our collar right side out and say hello to our cute little ruffles. Hi, Ruffles. Lovely, and they don't need to be like perfect or anything. Kind of the charm of it is that they might be like a little uneven and a little bit wonky in certain places, but I think that makes it all the cuter. Now what we need to do is get this collar looking really nice and sharp, because it's kind of just like a bubbly mess right now. So our seam that we just made, it'll want to kind of suck in the fabric, and it's our job to come around with our fingertips and sort of pull back the fabric out of that seam, come in with our iron and press it really well. And once you've worked your way all the way around on one side, flip it over, and you might notice that that seam tried to suck in the fabric from the back side too. So work your way around one more time using your fingers to pull that fabric out of the seam and get everything looking nice and crispy. Now, if one of your stitching lines from creating your ruffles is showing on your ruffles, is peeking out a little bit, that doesn't typically bother me. I would usually just leave that, but if it bugs you, you can come in with your seam ripper and just rip those stitches out. They don't matter or mean much anymore now that your ruffle is held together by the seam of the collar itself. You can trim up any little spillover at your center front here. Optionally, if you'd like to take this over to your sewing machine, you could do a top stitch running right next to those ruffles all the way around on the side of the seam that's like the collar side, and just back stitch at each end. I think I'll go ahead and do that to mine. After doing that top stitch, you might have kind of like a little bit of like a wonkiness to your collar. Just come through with your iron and press it really, really nice and flat. All right, and that is your assembled Peter Pan collar with ruffles. Our next step is to attach it to our bodice neckline. All right, bringing back out our bodice. I have my bodice facing wrong sides up, and I'm going to be showing you how to attach the band collar or the traditional collar. Remember that our band collar and our traditional have the same core collar stand piece here. And so either one is gonna have the same method to connect to the neckline of our bodice. I'm just going to be doing the one with the ruffles, but both should follow these instructions.
Hi, this is video editor Leah from the future coming in real quick with a note that after I filmed the sewing tutorial, I actually decided that doing the steps in a different order than I originally planned was going to make it easier for you to sew on the buttons later. So you're going to see as we assemble our collar to our neckline that I've already attached my bodice upper pieces to each other, and so it's going to make the neck hole like a round circle at this point. Just ignore that. Imagine your two bodice upper pieces are loose leaf. They're not connected to each other yet. They're just attached at the shoulder seams to your bodice back upper pieces. Okay, so ignore anywhere where you see the little seam connecting the button plackets at the bottom and proceed.
So what we're going to do is we are going to place, again with our bodice wrong sides up, we are going to wrap our collar around and pin it with the right side of the collar and the unfolded side of the collar lined up and pinned to the neckline of the bodice. And we want it so that the very edge of our collar stand is just perfectly lined up with that folded edge of our bodice. Sometimes I have to put my pin in diagonally because it gets a little too jammed if I were to try and put it in straight up and down. So I'll start with that first pin in there, kind of on a diagonal, and work my way around. Something that helps before you get going is to find the midline of your collar stand if you don't already have it marked. Just do that by folding it in half. And now I know that this fold right here is where I want to meet on the center back of my bodice, which I have marked with pencil. I like to usually first line up 3 points. That inner corner point that we did first, the center back, and the other inner corner point. That way I just know that those 3 points, which really need to end up in the right spot, start off in the correct spot. And then if I have any kind of discrepancies between my collar stand and my bodice, and I need to kind of pull or tug one of the two to make sure they match up, I can do so in this in-between area right here. So I'll sort of kind of pick it up and pull, hold the two. You can see I'm holding and I'm just kind of seeing, okay, I want to place a pin right about here to keep it evenly spread all the way around. And I'm going to just now start adding pins all the way around this neckline, attaching the right side of the collar, the unfolded collar piece, to the wrong side of my bodice. I'm noticing on mine that my collar feels a little tiny bit short compared to the bodice. And sometimes that's because the neckline might have still gotten a little bit stretched out while we were constructing things on the bodice. And our collar stand might need to stretch and tug just a little bit to be the same length as it. So don't be afraid to sort of manipulate and stretch your fabric little bits to get them to line up in length. We have pinned all the way around our neckline on the unfolded edge, and I am going to take this over to my sewing machine and I'm going to stitch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance along the neckline where we just pinned. And what's really crucial is that we start with our needle in right at this point, where our collar stand starts to like fold down. All right, so that's exactly right below that, on the other side of that fold, is right where we're gonna start our stitching. I'm gonna show you over on the sewing machine. Right here, where this folded part of the collar stand meets up with the other part of the collar stand. Okay, so right there is where we're gonna start our stitching and then work our way through. So what I like to do is kind of use my finger on this side to peel back that folded edge, because otherwise you might accidentally sort of get it sucked into your stitching here. So we're going to sort of peel that back just a little bit. We're going to line up our sewing machine needle and hope for the best. Here we go. As you're going around this curve, you want to kind of feel with your fingers on this side that there isn't fabric from your bodice that's sort of kind of like puckering underneath the collar stand. As you go, you just want to kind of shift it around, make sure that everything in this area right here is laying super flat and not getting any tucks or puckers. Now as I get to the end here again, I'm going to want to make sure I'm ending. Again, right, you see where the folded edge here is meeting up? That is the exact spot I want my needle to end and do my little back stitching. All right, here's how that seam looks finished. It's a little more difficult to show because we're on kind of a rounded situation here, but I've got it sewn to our neckline. And now our next move is going to be to trim down this seam allowance to about 1/4 inch. That's gonna help it tuck a little bit easier into the collar stand in a moment. All right, our next step is to sort of flip our collar stand so that it's kind of right sides out. And that seam that we just made right here, we're going to want to press that seam up toward the collar stand. So we have our collar this way. It's a little bit difficult because you're going to be working around, but you're going to take your iron, use your fingers to sort of press that seam away from the bodice and toward the collar stand. Now we're going to turn our bodice right sides out, right sides facing up, and we are going to fold our collar stand. Remember how we already pre-made that fold there? We already pressed that, so it's all ready for us to just fall real neatly on top of and like covering that raw edge seam we made there. So I'm just going to basically pull down that collar stand on the right side of our fabric here, and we want the fold of the collar stand to fall right on top of, like just covering up that seam line that you'll be able to see there, and pin that in place. We're going to work our way all the way around, paying extra attention to getting a really nice clean curve here. Trim off any crazy threads, get a nice clean corner and curve here where our center front button placket is going to be. Now, if you needed to do a little bit of that manipulation and stretching of your collar stand on the other side, then you're probably gonna have to do that a little bit on this side too. When you look at the center front area where your collar is sort of like hitting the center front placket, we want that to be a slight curve. So just kind of use your fingers if you need to. That seam might have sucked in, eaten some of your fabric and made it kind of chunky or wonky. Do your best to use your fingers to sort of mold that and shape it into a little bit of a slight curved shape. Now we're going to take this over to our sewing machine, and we are going to stitch, top stitch, all the way around our collar stand. We're going to go all the way around the spot that we just pinned. We're going to pivot at the corner of where the collar stand meets the placket. We're going to pivot right there, and we are going to curve up, and then we're actually going to stitch really close, like 1/8 of an inch away from that seam where either your collar stand ends or meets your ruffles or meets your traditional collar. So you're going to pivot, and then you're going to work your way all the way around on that top edge back to where you started. I recommend that you start and stop this stitch over here by your shoulder seam. If you start and stop it over here, you might get some messy back stitching and some frustration going on that becomes evident. And this is like the most visible part of your shirt, is right here at the front center. So go ahead and start this stitching over at the shoulder seam or in the back. As you get to the curve of the center front, just take it really slow, kind of like one stitch at a time. Like take a stitch, and you might even like lift up your presser foot, take another couple of stitches, and if you get stuck, like you can't get your fabric to keep pushing through, then you want to lift up that presser foot, put some fabric behind what you're working on, just so that your feed dogs down below have something to grab onto and push forward. Alrighty, here's how that seam looks finished. I am so happy with the results. This is what it looks like on the collar, on like the back of the bodice, and all the way around to our center front. This is a pretty tricky part of the sewing pattern, so if this got you kind of caught up or frustrated. I promise you made it through. I'm so happy for you. And luckily these are pretty small pattern pieces. So if you're looking at yours and you're like, man, this is not my best work, you could always rip this out and do it again. The second, third, fourth time you do anything always turns out much better. Not saying you have to. You can also stick with what you got. Even if you don't like it, you did it. I'm so proud of you. Let's keep moving on with the pattern. In this section of the video, I'm going to show you how to attach the Peter Pan collar, whether you did ruffles or no ruffles, to our bodice neckline. So to start, we are going to take our Peter Pan collar and we are going to position it on the neckline with our inner raw edge of the collar, lining up with that inner raw edge of our neckline. If you're doing the one without ruffles, I guess with or without, you want the top side of your collar facing up, and you want the right side of your bodice also facing up. I'm going to go around and pin everything, aligning at our center front notches here. If you did the Peter Pan collar and you're confused because you already made like your center front placket and you're wondering, why do I have so much space here? You should not have sewn your center front button placket yet if you're doing the Peter Pan collar. So go ahead and seam rip that out if you already did it. If you're feeling like your collar is just a little bit short, not quite as long as this curve right here, it's possible that your bodice neckline got stretched out as you were constructing the shoulder seams or just moving your fabric around in general. So what you might need to do is use your iron to sort of pinch together and re-shorten your bodice neckline, and you might also kind of stretch your collar a little bit around that curve to get it to be the same length as your bodice neckline. It's okay if you have to manipulate the fabric a little bit here. All right, once you have it pinned all the way around, next we're going to take this over to our sewing machine and we're going to stitch from that very starting end of our Peter Pan collar around that neckline and ending at the other end of the collar. We're going to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance this time and backstitch at each end. Here's what that seam looks like finished. It's going through the 2 layers of our collar as well as our bodice fabric. Now you might notice that I'm using a different color weird fabric this time for my bodice. That's just because I'm using an old bed sheet. I didn't want to recreate the same garment so many different times. So you'll see this bed sheet fabric come up again later. Now to help this curve work, we are just going to make little snips with our scissors, not cutting into the stitches that we just made, but stopping just before those. And about every 1 inch or so around this curve, I'm just gonna make a little snip to help it lie flat. Next, we are going to work on that button placket area. So I'm going to turn this so the wrong side of the bodice is facing up, and I am going to turn my center front of my bodice toward the wrong side of the fabric by 1/2 inch. I'm going to repeat that over on my other side. Now I'm going to turn the garment over to the right side. So the right side of my bodice is facing up. I'm going to fold my button placket toward the right side this time by 1 1/8 inch. Use my ruler to double check. Press that in place. So you can see I've already got that 1/2 inch fold folded back, and I'm still folding it another 1 1/8 inch. Repeat that on the other side. Let's pin this in place, and we're going to take this over to our sewing machine, and we are going to stitch down this fold right here using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So it's going to sort of kind of run right into that 1/4 inch seam allowance we made earlier. And you can backstitch at each end. Here's what that seam looks like finished. Now we want to clean up this neckline a little bit here. So we're going to take our bias binding strip for the Peter Pan collar, and we are going to wrap it around. If you have a wrong side and a right side to yours, you want the wrong side facing up towards you and the right side facing down towards your bodice. And you are going to start it somewhere just kind of like halfway into that button placket folded area we just made. You can either just take this straight over to your sewing machine and start stitching with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, or you can pin it all the way around if you're feeling a little bit like taking it slow and getting everything in the right place, if you're feeling like it. So it's going to start and end overlapping into that button placket area about halfway into it. We're going to take this over to our sewing machine and stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, backstitching at each end. Here's what that seam looks like finished. All right, now we're going to take our iron and press that bias binding strip and the seam allowance that we just created. We're going to press all of that away from the bodice towards the center, kind of towards that center hole. Now we're going to flip our bodice over so the wrong side of our bodice is facing up, and we're going to grab that bias binding and we're just going to fold it over all of our raw edges right here and all the way around. We're going to be folding it so that the raw edge of our bias binding is going to line up and hit right at this stitching line that we just created. And we're going to come around with our iron and press that in place as we fold it over. Then we're going to do a second turn. So we're going to fold towards the wrong side again. And this time we're going to do a couple extra things here. So we're folding again by a 1/4 inch, but we're going to pull that collar out and away from our bodice. And we're also going to turn just a little bit, turn our button placket to be sort of right sides out. So now you can see our folded bias binding is going to kind of disappear nice into our button placket. And we are pulling our collar away just to make sure it's not going to get stuck in the next seam we're going to do. All right, we're over at our sewing machine. I am going to be starting my stitching on this bias binding by kind of pulling the button placket out of the way a little bit so that I can get in right here. See, I'm just going to kind of fold it back a little. And then I'm going to proceed with my bias binding being double folded, and make sure that your collar is out here out of the way and not tucked under your fabric. And now I'm over to my other edge where, of course, my button placket doesn't really know which side it wants to be on. Ignore my little rip right here. We're gonna just kind of pull it out of the way. All right, here's that seam finished. Now we're ready to work on finishing our button placket area. This is where we had kind of started with our 1/2 inch fold and then our 1 1/8 inch fold. And we should have that turned right side out at this point. And we're gonna come in with a pointy but somewhat blunt object. I like to use a mechanical pencil and just kind of poke out that inner corner there so we get a nice sharp right angle. Then we can come in with our iron and press this down, making sure that we're sticking to our 1 1/8 inch fold size for that placket there. Now we'll pin this and we are ready to take it over to our sewing machine. We are going to stitch down as close as possible to that inner fold, about 1/8 inch away, back stitching at each end. Here's what the seam looks like finished on the wrong side of the bodice, and here's what it looks like on the right side of the bodice, and then with our Peter Pan collar folded down over it. And you'll just want to repeat this over on the other side on your other button placket.
Hi friends, it's Leah editing the sewing tutorial video here. And after I filmed the tutorial, I realized that I wanted to do some of the steps in a different order. It will make it a lot easier for you. So the steps that I have written in the sewing instruction booklet are accurate. You want to go from attaching your collar to your bodice upper, and then you want to add the buttons and buttonholes. In the video I filmed, I did it in a different order, and so I hope it's not too confusing for you. You're basically going to see me add buttons to the bodice after I've already constructed the bodice upper to the lower part of the bodice. Just ignore that. You're going to go in the order of adding the collar to the neckline and then adding your buttons. And then of course, when you see attaching the bodice pieces together in a much later step, there's not gonna be any buttons on it, and there will be in yours. So just bear with me. Hopefully that makes sense. Thanks.
Now we're ready to add our buttonholes and our buttons. So I have heard some people say that they know they always want to just wear this open, so they don't even bother with adding any closures here. You could also do snaps if that's your thing and you have the toolkit for it. But I'm going to show you real quick how I do buttons. I'm using 1/2" wooden buttons right now, and you can kind of play around with the spacing that you want to do.
What's most important is that the bottom of your lowest buttonhole is at least 1 inch away from the bottom of your bodice front upper, because we need plenty of space there to be able to create the seam with a 1/2" seam allowance between your bodice front upper and the lower part of your bodice, and a little bit here.
We have a pretty small space here. You technically probably only need like 2 buttons, but some people might find that they like the look of 3. If you have a matching real tiny small button, you could do a little button up there on your collar neckband. It is going to be quite a tight squeeze to get a buttonhole and button up there, but I always love the look of a shirt buttoned all the way up to the very top. So yeah, you can kind of just play around. But once you decide, just consider marking it with a pencil or something that's like heat erasable where you want the bottom of each buttonhole to go. For my garment, I think I'm going to do 3 buttons just on the button placket. I would say if you are a more beginner sewist, then a button up here on your collar stand might feel a little bit more just kind of like fidgety, but you can definitely do it. What I recommend is doing vertical buttonholes down here where your buttonhole is going to go lengthwise, like tall ways, like the letter I. And if you're going to do a buttonhole up here on your collar stand, I recommend doing it horizontal and just trying to keep it lined up kind of and centered with your placket here, so that when everything closes, you still have everything in the center. So I'm gonna go ahead and do my 3 buttons here. Generally, you can just kind of mark about like 1/8 of an inch on either side of the button where you're going to start and stop your buttonhole. Now there are ways that you can hand stitch buttonholes. I am not going to show you that today, but you should definitely look on YouTube if you think that might be your best route. Maybe your sewing machine doesn't have a buttonhole foot, or you just hate the buttonhole foot on your sewing machine, that's fine too. I'm going to be using the buttonhole foot on my machine, so let's take it over there. All right, I've got my 3 buttonholes sewn, and now I'm ready to open them up and place my buttons. My favorite method is to fold my buttonholes in half, kind of feel out with my fingers that it's perfectly lined up, and just take my scissors and go snip. My scissors are pretty sharp. I think if you don't have good sharp scissors, this could be more of a headache, but I just like to snip right in. Another method you can do is place a pin at one end of the buttonhole and then grab your seam ripper, and the pin's there to make sure your seam ripper doesn't go too far, but you stick your seam ripper in at one end and push through until you've hit that pin. I find that my scissor snipping method is a little bit cleaner than the seam ripper method, but either one will work. Now that we have our buttons snipped open, we can go ahead and line up our button placket, our collar stand, get it really nice and looking good. And then I like to place my buttons by just poking through my opened buttonholes with a pen or pencil and making a dot on the underside, just perfectly centered where I want those buttons. Now I'll grab the 3 buttons that I'm going to use and place them on their marks. And a neat trick for you is to use tape to sew on your buttons. This really helps to keep them in place so they don't start slipping around everywhere. So I'll grab a button with my tape and place it right on its mark. Grab the button, place it on its mark, tape it into place. All right, once they're taped on there, I take this over to the button foot on my sewing machine and I stitch back and forth in between 2 of these holes to get these secured. Now, if you don't have a button foot on your machine or you just want to use your hands, there's not that many buttons. It'd be pretty easy to sew these by hand. You can go ahead and do that using embroidery thread or regular sewing machine thread. Just get them secured on there as best you can. All right, here's how my buttons and my buttonholes look finished. Here's how it looks all buttoned up. Now we're ready to join our bodice upper front pieces. So with right sides of the bodice facing up, we're going to overlap the left placket over the right placket, and we're going to just make sure that that fold of the left placket is lining up perfectly with the stitching line on the right hand side. And then we're going to pin that in place. Just 1 or 2 pins will do it. And we'll take this over to our sewing machine, and just to hold it in place for now, we're going to stitch about 1/4 inch from our raw edge down here, back stitching at each end. Here's how that stitching looks when it's finished. All right, we're ready to move on with the rest of our bodice construction. The next thing we are going to do is we are going to be gathering our bodice pieces to fit the bodice upper portion here. So that is a very exciting step. This is where we're going to start to see the garment really taking shape. So I'm going to grab my bodice front and my bodice back pieces. You should have the notches marked on each of these. And what we're going to start with is sewing a gathering stitch between our 2 notches. So over on the sewing machine, I am going to run a line of stitching 1/8 inch away from the raw edge. You're going to kind of pivot here when you get to this V point, and we are going to back stitch at one end, and at the other end, no back stitching. We're just going to leave a tail of threads that's about like 6 inches long. And then we're going to do the same stitch parallel to that about 1/4 inch from the raw edge. We're going to back stitch at the first end, and we're going to leave a tail of threads about 6 inches at the other end. All right, so that's 2 parallel lines of stitching. Back stitch at the beginning, don't back stitch at the end. We're going to repeat those same 2 stitches on our bodice back piece. Again, running the lines of stitching between our 2 notches up here. For this step, you're going to be using the longest stitch length on your sewing machine. All right, here's what those stitches look like finished. Now we're ready to actually give them a tug and get them to be the right length for our bodice. So let's just start with the bodice front. I'm going to get my bodice upper pieces ready up here, and I've got the notches marked on them as well. And I'm going to grab the bodice front piece. Now, if you're getting confused and you can't remember which one is your bodice front and which one's your bodice back, your bodice front is the wider one. Bodice back is a little bit more narrow. So we are going to grab our bodice front, and we are going to place it right sides facing, aligning the raw edges with our bodice upper portion here. What I want to do is align 3 key spots. So my center front, which I can still kind of see on mine because I cut mine on the fold, I can see the center front line of my bodice front here. I'm going to align that right in the center between, right in the middle of my button plackets there. I know that's one point that I'm going to want to align. I'm going to pin that together loosely real quick. And the other spots that we're going to want to match up are our notches on both, and of course the sleeve hem, kind of like where everything ends over on the sides over here. So the way I like to do my gathering is on like a soft ironing board surface that I can actually like dig a pin into. That way I can sort of anchor my garment to the surface at several points and then pull the gathering thread to get everything just the right length. So let me show you. The first thing I do is I go to that area where we have our back stitching on our gathering threads, and I put a pin through not just the top layer or my bottom layer that I'm connecting it to, but also through my ironing board. So I'm pushing my pin all the way through and getting it through all those layers and back up. And now you can see I can't even lift this off my ironing board. It's attached right there, sort of anchored there. The next spot I'll do is at the end of where I'm gathering. So that's going to be at this notch over here where my loose tail threads are. And I just try and keep that bottom layer nice and flat up against the ironing board. Again, I'm going through all my layers here, even my ironing board surface, getting my pin through there. Then just one more pin I place off a few inches off to the side. That's going to be our anchor pin. So I grab the top 2 threads of our gathering stitches that we just made, and we're going to grab the 2 that are on top here. We're going to start pulling them and using our other hand, kind of pinching the fabric and pulling it down those threads. So we start getting some of these little gathered ruffle areas. Now for now, I'm going to actually take this pin out from the center front area so I can move my ruffles all the way down. And I pull that gathering until the tension has it so that this piece is taut and the exact same length as my under layer right here. I'm going to grab with the strings with my left hand, and I just do a figure 8 around my anchor pin, around top and bottom parts there, to keep that in place. And now I have both hands free to get my ruffles as evenly spaced as possible. So this is where we want to kind of line up that center front of our bodice with the center front of the bodice upper. And now I'm going to place that pin there, going to space out my ruffles a little bit more evenly here on both sides. Once I feel like my ruffles are spaced pretty evenly, I'll come in with my iron and just squish them. Just press down, press down, press down. Get them nice and flat. And then I'll pin every few inches, not through the ironing board, just through my garment this time. Then we're ready to take out our pins that are anchoring us down. So I'll pull out that first pin. I want to put it back in, though I do still want to hold the fabric there. And I'll take this one out from the ironing board, put it back just through the fabric, and we can release our side anchor pin there. Now we're ready to take this over to our sewing machine, and we are going to stitch actually all the way across this time. So instead of just between our notches, we are going to do a straight stitch from our very corner of our sleeve hem on one side all the way across to the corner of the other sleeve hem on our other side. You can go ahead and pin those in place as well. We're going to be doing a 1/2 inch seam allowance back stitching at each end. I like to put this through my sewing machine with the ruffle side up. After your straight stitch, we want to protect this seam and get all these little fuzzy mans off of here. So we are going to take it and do some sort of finishing stitch. Whatever's in your practice today is perfectly fine, whether you're using a serger or a zigzag stitch or faux overlock stitch. But we want to clean this up And whether you're doing your serger or a zigzag stitch, this 1/2 inch seam allowance is a bit bulky, and even taking it under a serger, it can kind of clog up with your knife and everything. So I like to just come through and trim it with scissors first, down to about 1/4 inch. And just make sure that you're not accidentally cutting into a bodice piece that's flipped around anywhere. But we're gonna come around, trim this down to 1/4 inch, then take it over and do our serger or zigzag stitch or binding or whatever your heart desires. All right, here's what that seam looks like finished. Now to really polish this off and make it look more professional, we are going to turn the bodice to the right side facing up, and we're gonna take that seam allowance that we just made, and we're going to push it and press it up towards the bodice upper portion. So I like to just come in with my fingers and sort of maneuver and feel around, make sure it's all pushing upward, come in with my iron, continue to push, then press that seam so it's really nice and flat and crisp. Then we'll go over to our sewing machine and we'll do a top stitch 1/8 inch away from that seam line we just made, and back stitch at each end. All right, here's what that seam looks like finished. Now we're just going to repeat all of these steps to attach our bodice back to our bodice back upper over on this side. So just same thing, we're going to lay out our bodice back upper, and with right sides facing, we are going to align our bodice back at the center, the sides, and the notches. We're gonna pull those gathering threads till they're the right length. We're going to do our 1/2 inch seam allowance and then serge or zigzag stitch to protect those seams. And yes, your back should look slightly less gathered or ruffled or bunched than your front. And here's how the seam looks finished on the back. All right, it is time to work on our sleeve variations. So there are 7 sleeve variations to this pattern, and I'm going to show you how to do all of them. This is going to be one of those times where you want to skip to the part in the video that applies to the version you're doing. In this section of the video, I'm going to show you how we are going to do just the short sleeve version. Super sweet and simple. We are going to turn our garment over to the wrong side, and we are just going to turn our sleeve hem under by 1/2 inch and press. And that's all we're gonna do right now for the short sleeve hem. We're going to return to finish this after we do our side seams on the bodice. In this section of the video, I'm going to show you how to do the long sleeve or the 3/4 length sleeve to add to the bodice. You should have 2 pieces of sleeve cut out. And if you have a clear front and back side to your fabric, then these pieces should be mirrored. I'm just gonna show you how to do it on one of them. You'll repeat it for the second sleeve. So what we want to do is we want to take our sleeve piece and we want to have it wrong side facing up. We're going to turn under that bottom hem by 1/4 inch toward the wrong side and press with our iron. We'll return to finish this hem in a later step. All right, so now to attach our sleeve to our bodice, we are going to place our sleeve right sides facing with our bodice. We're going to line up our center shoulder notch. We should have marked our back and our front to our sleeve, and we want to make sure the back is aligned with the back and the front is with the front. They're 2 different lengths, so that's why we have it like that. And we're just going to line up and pin along that raw edge there. Then we'll take this over to our sewing machine and do a straight stitch with 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at each end. Then we want to protect this seam with either serging, zigzagging, whatever's in your practice today. Here's what that seam looks like finished. Now we just want to make it look a little bit more polished and professional, so we're going to flip our garment over with right side facing up, and we're going to press that seam allowance down towards the sleeve, away from the bodice. So I'm using my fingers to kind of push and roll it down and my iron to press it. Now we're going to take this over to our sewing machine and we're going to do a top stitch 1/8 inch away from that initial seam line. stitching through the seam allowance and the sleeve, back stitching at each end. Here's what that seam looks like finished. All right, that's it for our long sleeve or our 3/4 length sleeve. We'll finish up this bottom hem after we do our underarm and side seam stitches. The next sleeve variation is the ruffle sleeve. Now, this is the exact same method I use for my sanctuary jumpsuit pattern, so I'm gonna insert a clip from that video here to show you how to attach the ruffle sleeve. I have my 2 long rectangles that we cut out earlier for our sleeve ruffles. I have the wrong sides facing up, and to start, I'm just going to turn the bottom edge. There is no top and bottom, but just whatever way you've oriented it here. The bottom edge, I'm going to turn up towards the wrong side by about 1/4 inch and press it with my iron. This is going to just start the hem for us and make it a little bit easier later when we finish the hem a little bit down the line. Now we're going to take each rectangle over to our sewing machine, and we're going to run 2 long basting stitches across the top unfolded edge of our rectangle. For the basting stitch, I'm going to back stitch at the beginning, I'm going to run all the way down, and I'm not going to back stitch at the end. Instead, I'm going to actually leave like 6 inches of tail thread hanging off here, something that I'll be able to pull later to be able to gather this fabric up. For each basting stitch, we're going to run them parallel to each other. We'll do one at a little under 1/2 inch and one at 1/4 inch from the raw edge. Just remember, you're going to be back stitching at the beginning, no back stitch at the end. We're going to repeat that same stitch on our other sleeve ruffle piece, and I'll show you over at the sewing machine. You want to put your machine settings on the longest stitch length. All right, let's bring our bodice back out, and we're going to place our bodice with right sides facing up, orient ourselves with our sleeve. So this is my bodice front, this is my bodice back, this is my shoulder seam here, and I'm going to be adding my ruffle right along this raw edge right here. So I'm going to be wanting to gather up this ruffle so that it meets up with the exact length of my sleeve raw edge, and that's what we're going to go ahead and do right now. What I like to do, because I'm doing all this on a soft ironing board, this ruffle piece is right sides facing with my bodice. So I have my wrong side facing up, and I'm going to take the end where I did do my back stitch. I'm going to align that with one end of my bodice. And I like to pin that to the bodice, but I'm not just pinning it to the bodice. I'm pinning it to the bodice and I kind of hook it in and back up through my ironing board cover. This is just a quick tip for you, totally optional, but it helps me sort of anchor everything in place as I go to pull those threads. Then I'm going to do the same thing over here on this edge. This is my loose thread end where I didn't back stitch. And I'm going to line that up, and right at the edge corner there, I'm going to pin that in place. I'm pinning it both to the bodice and my ironing board cover so that everything's sort of stuck in place. I couldn't pull this off my ironing board if I wanted to. So then the last pin I like to place here for the moment is going to be a few inches off, a few inches to the side of my bodice here. That's going to go through just my ironing board cover, and that's going to be an anchor pin for us to sort of hook our threads onto once we've pulled them. Now, we have our loose threads over here where we didn't back stitch, right? I'm going to take just the top 2 threads, the ones that are coming up off the top of the fabric. Leave those bottom threads behind. They're just going to lay down there, chill out for now. And I'm going to take these 2 threads and I'm going to start to gently pull them while I sort of hold the fabric with my fingers, and I can start to move this gathering down so that it starts to evenly spread. And as I'm pulling those two threads. I don't want those threads to break, so I'm doing it pretty gently and starting to move my ruffle all the way across. And eventually what I'm trying to get to here is so that the full length of my sleeve ruffle is the exact same length as the raw edge of the sleeve down below it. I want these ruffles to be relatively evenly spaced. These two ends here, they're going to be basically at our underarm side, and it's also going to be where our seam is to connect everything. So I probably won't put much ruffling within about an inch or so of my two ends here. I'm going to keep most of my ruffling spaced evenly though throughout the rest of our width here. And once I think it's looking the right length and everything, I can take the threads that I've been pulling and holding on to, and I can do a little figure 8 wrapping around my anchor pin over here that I put into my ironing board. That just helps make it now so that everything is held in place on my ruffle at this nice perfect length with my sleeve. That way now I have my hands free to be able to pin and iron, press everything into place and get it ready to take over to the sewing machine. So let's do just that. I'm going to come in with my iron, and I like to just press, squish down onto everything. Use lots of steam, get it into place. Then I'm going to come in with a pin every few inches. And this time I'm not going through my ironing board cover anymore. Now I'm just going through the fabric of my garment to secure my sleeve ruffle with the bodice. Then I can remove my anchor pins here that's holding it onto the ironing board, replace them because I still want that sleeve held to the bodice at those points. And I can also remove my anchor pin way down here. I'll take that guy out. And I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine. I'm going to change my thread length back to normal. Then I'm going to do a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way down, making sure that my seam falls sort of right inside of our basting stitches here so that they don't show in the final garment. And we're going to back stitch at both ends. Then I'm going to take this over to my serger and protect this raw edge right here. You could also do zigzag stitch or binding or whatever suits your sewing practice today. Then we'll go over to the other side of our bodice and repeat all of these steps for our other sleeve. If you're going to protect the seam with a zigzag stitch, you might find that the 1/2 inch seam allowance is a little bit bulky on the underside of your sleeve. So you could always trim this down to a 1/4 inch and then protect your seam with your zigzag or faux overlock or however you're going to manage. And if you are using a serger, I often do this anyway because I find that my serger has a hard time going through thicker areas like this sort of ruffled up part. So I'll often just on something like this, just to be safe and not frustrate myself too much over at my serger, I'll just go ahead and like manually trim this seam allowance with my scissors so that when I take it over to my serger, I don't actually have to use the knife at all. I just serge right up along the edge. All right, here's what that looks like finished. But we're not fully done with it. We want it to look really nice and clean and flat on the other side of the garment. So what I'm going to do is flip my bodice so that it is right sides facing up. And I've got my beautiful ruffle here, but I want it to lie really nice and flat at the seam line. So I'm going to, with my fingers, sort of work that seam allowance that we just made on the back side. I'm going to push it up towards the bodice or towards our sleeve bodice area, away from the ruffle. And once I've got it positioned there, I'm going to press with my iron, nice and flat. And then we'll take this over to our sewing machine, and with a straight stitch, we're going to stitch all the way along that seam on the side of the bodice, back stitching at each end, and just stitching as close as you can, about 1/8 of an inch away from that original seam line we just made. Go ahead and repeat those steps over on your other sleeve ruffle as well. Here's what that looks like finished. Now we're ready to basically complete our bodice by stitching our underarms and sides. In this section, I'm going to show you how to sew the double ruffle sleeve variation, and I'm going to be doing it on my real sample this time. So I am going to start off by just serging the raw edge of our sleeve hem area on our bodice. Do not trim any fabric in the process. If you don't have a serger, of course, you can zigzag stitch or do a faux overlock stitch. But here's how that looks serged. You're going to repeat that on both sleeve hems. Now let's grab our 2 ruffle, double ruffle, technically, pieces, and we're going to start with just one here. We're going to fold down one long edge down towards the right side of the fabric by 1/4 inch. Press with your iron. Next, I'm going to flip over my sleeve here, and I'm going to take that other really long edge and I'm going to flip it towards the wrong side of the fabric by 1/4 inch and then again by another 1/4 inch. Now we're going to take this over to our sewing machine and we're going to do a stitch all the way along that inner fold, about 1/8 inch or like as close as you can get to that inner fold, back stitching at each end. This is going to become the hem of our first, like our top ruffle that comes off of the sleeve. It'll be all gathered up here, and this will be the hemline. So if you're planning on doing anything kind of extra special to your double ruffle sleeve, you can consider tucking something into this hemline here. Something that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to flip-flop this, and I'm going to have it so that my hem is facing out from the garment, and I'm going to be tucking in a fun little applique that I'm going to do. I'm going to hand applique this strip that I made here. I'll have a blog post or some sort of tutorial about it posted somewhere. Hopefully you can find it on my website. And I am going to actually kind of tuck my bottom of my applique strip down into that seam, and then I'm just going to hand stitch up here on my zigzag part. But I thought this would be a cute seam to tuck it into. This could also be a really good seam if you are just going ruffleaholic and you're addicted to them. You could also do the same kind of ruffles that we do on the collar. You could add those ruffles into this seam right here as well, so that your ruffle sleeve is like just a ruffle maniac. All right, so just keep that in mind. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to kind of flip-flop my bottom hem so that it's tucked the other way. So bear with me. If you're doing nothing, you're just keeping a plain sleeve here, then you're most likely going to want to do what I did at the very beginning. Turn one edge toward the right side by 1/4 inch once, then turn the other long edge toward the wrong side, double fold, and press with your iron. All right, so I've kind of adjusted my hemlines how I want it so that I can add in my applique into that seam right there. But we are going to, at this stage, decide how kind of wide we want each ruffle tier. So you could do like a really big bottom ruffle and a small little one. You can kind of bunch it up to see how that might look. Or you could do the bottom one only sticking out a little bit at the bottom. Bunch that up, kind of see how that would look. I am going to, I think, go somewhere just in between, a classic middle ground, something like that, so that my ruffles end up being a little bit more even-ish, doing a little bit more on the top. Wherever you choose, you're going to press that fold really well. You might want to take note of the measurement here. So mine is 5 3/8 inches, and that's what I'm gonna wanna do over on my other sleeve double ruffle, just to make sure everything stays consistent. If you're tucking anything into this seam, go ahead and place that now. You could pin it across if that helps you keep it in place. Ultimately though, we are just going to take this hem over to our sewing machine and do a straight stitch, back stitching at each end, trying to stay as close to that inner fold as possible. Then go ahead and repeat these steps over on your other sleeve double ruffle. All right, now let's do that fold, folding our kind of top ruffle down over what will be our bottom second ruffle by the amount that you want. Make sure you do it the same on both double ruffle sleeve pieces. I've got the fold that I want. I pressed it really well with my iron, and now I'm going to come in and do 2 gathering stitches across the top here. And we've done gathering stitches before, so we should remember how to do that. We're gonna do a back stitch at the beginning and not at the end. We're gonna leave a thread tail of about 6 inches at the end. You could do your 2 parallel stitches anywhere you want, really. When this all gathers up, if you put your stitches lower down, like let's say 3/4 of an inch and an inch away from the top fold here, then you're gonna have more like fabric up here that is going to be kind of its own third ruffle almost. Or you could keep your stitching really close to the top here, and so all that gathering and all the volume really happens down here in your double ruffle and not so much up here towards your seam. I think I'm gonna go with maybe like a 1/4 inch and a 1/2 inch for myself up here, away from that folded line. Then just go ahead and repeat the same thing over on your other sleeve ruffle piece, 2 gathering stitches. Just a reminder, do the longest stitch length on your sewing machine. Here's how those stitches look when they're in. We've got no back stitching at this end, so we've got something to grab onto and gather. We're pulling our bodice back out here, and we have our bodice right side facing up. We're gonna do this very similar to how we gathered our bodice pieces to our bodice upper, except this time instead of doing right sides facing, which you could technically do, but I like to do it this way. So since we have already this really nice fold here, we can actually have the gathers exposed on the outside of the garment. You'll see what I mean in a second. But I'm gonna do a very similar setup. So I'm going to start pinning things to my ironing board, if you remember how I did that. I want my sleeve double ruffle to just overlap, like wrong side, I guess, of my sleeve ruffle on top of the right side of the bodice. I'm gonna have them overlap by at least a 1/2 inch, probably closer to 3/4 of an inch. That's kind of just based on the distance that I did my gathering stitching at. I want to make sure I have enough room. This is basically just going to overlap, and you're going to end up top stitching this ruffle to your sleeve. So let me go ahead and set my pins. I'm going to set my starter pin here and my ending pin at the other end, and grab my top 2 threads and start pulling. Once I've gathered it so much that the tension of my double ruffle pulled straight and taut is the same length as my bodice sleeve hem here, then I can go ahead, set my anchor pin, if that's the way you're doing it, do my figure 8 around it. And now you want to distribute the gathering evenly throughout. I like to do less gathering within the first inch or so on either side, because that's where our underarm seam is going to be, and I don't really like a lot of bulk in my underarm area. All right, once you have it gathered the way you'd like, we're gonna come in with our iron and press, press, press. Flatten it a little bit so it's easier to get under the sewing machine. Then we'll come in with pins and pin it down. Check every once in a while here to like make sure that you are overlapping still the amount that you want to be onto your bodice. All right, I'll take out my starting and ending pins and replace them just on the garment. Take out my anchor pin, and we're all set to take this over to our sewing machine. Just like the bodice, we're going to do a straight stitch from one end to the next. Turn your machine setting back to its regular stitch length for this, and back stitch at each end. You choose where you want to do this stitch. I like to do mine kind of in between the two gathering stitches I just did. So for me, I think that would be about 3/8 inches from my inner fold that I'll be doing my straight stitch. Here's how that seam looks finished. So nice and clean. I'm so happy with how it looks. This is from the right side of the garment, and this is from the wrong side of the garment. Now we'll repeat the same thing over on our other sleeve. I don't typically mind that our initial gathering stitches are still showing, but if it bugs you to have that many stitches there, you can always take your seam ripper and just take out those larger length stitches that we did for the gathering. Just keep your top stitch that's holding everything together. Up to you. I'm gonna leave mine the way it is. In this section of the video, I'm going to show how to create the bishop sleeve as a special sleeve extension. So our bishop sleeve, we have a giant rectangle. You should have 2 of them cut out, one for each of your sleeves, and you should also have a smaller rectangle piece that is your bishop hem binding. We're going to set that aside for now and work just with our giant rectangle. We are going to do 2 parallel rows of gathering stitches, one set up at the long top edge and one set down along the other long edge. There is no technical top and bottom, just you're going to do 2 rows here, 2 rows here, and these are gathering stitches just like we did on our bodice, where you're going to do back stitching at the beginning and use your longest stitch length to run all the way along about 1/8 of an inch, and then 1/4 inch away from the seam line. You're going to leave like 6 inches of thread tails at the end, no back stitching, so that you can pull those threads and gather the fabric. So I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and then also repeat these same stitches over on your other bishop sleeve piece. We have our 2 parallel rows here and our 2 parallel rows here. Now we're going to grab our bishop hem binding, and we are going to gather up one of these long edges of our bishop sleeve. We're going to gather it up so that it is eventually the width of our bishop binding, one of the long edges of that binding. So to do this, I am going to do the same method I did before with right sides facing each other. I like to start by pinning one corner and one corner. So our bishop binding is the piece that's going to be staying the same size, so it's going to be on the bottom of this gathering method I'm doing here, right up against our ironing board, which I've pinned into to hold everything in place. Now I'm just grabbing the top 2 threads of our bishop sleeve, and I'm going to start pulling them, moving the fabric along and gathering it down till it's eventually the length of that sleeve hem binding. All right, I've got it to the same length. Place my anchor pin, do a figure 8 with my thread to hold it in place. Now I have both hands free. I want to distribute these gathers evenly throughout, but I do kind of want to leave like around, I'd say about 1/2 inch over here by my pin. I'm going to leave that relatively flat because that's where our seam is going to be. So I'm going to not gather too much there. All right, beautiful. Once you've got them evenly spaced, come in with our iron and just smush, flatten. Then we'll place a pin every few inches. Unhook our first and last pin, just placing them into the garment, and take out our anchor pin. All right, we're going to take this over to our sewing machine, and we are going to stitch with 1/2 inch seam allowance. The stitch length should be back to normal, not your long one, and we are going to back stitch at each end. All right, here's what that seam looks like finished. got our hem binding under there. We're going to turn this over so we have our right side facing up. And we're going to take the seam allowance of the bishop hem binding and the bishop hem binding itself. We're going to point all of them away from the sleeve. So I'm going to fold this down over the seam allowance, use my fingers and my iron to press. Now we're ready to flip back over. So wrong side is now facing up. And now we're going to fold the long raw edge of our sleeve hem binding. We're going to fold it towards the sleeve so that its raw edge is now meeting up with the raw edge of the sleeve. That seam allowance that we had just created. It's kind of meeting in the middle there. All right, and then we're going to leave it just as is. I know it's unsatisfying, you want to finish it up, but we're going to leave it just as is until we have done our underarms of our bodice and sleeve. Once we've done that seam, we'll come back and finish up this seam and make it look really pretty and clean. But for now, we're just going to leave it, set it aside. We are ready to attach our sleeve, bishop sleeve attachment to our bodice at the bodice kind of sleeve hem here. So you can see this is my neckline and my back and my front of the bodice. Here's our sleeve line. We're going to attach the bishop sleeve to the bodice by doing a very similar method to what we just did. We're going to go right sides facing, sleeve with the bodice, and we are going to gather up the sleeve so that it's the same length as our sleeve hemline here. I'm going to do that with my pinning method. All right, I've gathered that to be the same length. I'm going to spread out my gathering evenly, not doing much gathering at all over by my side pins where my underarm is going to be. That looks good. We'll come in with our iron, press, 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 pin every few inches. And we'll take this over to our sewing machine and stitch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at each end. We're gonna finish it off just like we did our bodice by trimming it down to a 1/4 inch seam allowance and then serging it all the way across, or doing a zigzag stitch, whatever protective stitch you're using. Then once you have that seam protected, we're going to go to the right side of the garment facing up, and we're going to press that seam allowance we just made up towards the bodice away from the sleeve. Press that with our iron, and then back over at our sewing machine, we're going to do a top stitch 1/8 of an inch away from that seam line, back stitching at each end. Here's what that looks like finished. And that's as far as we're going to go on our bishop sleeve until we revisit our wrist hemline here after we've done our side seams and underarm. In this section of the video, I'm going to show you how to create the 2-tier bell flare sleeve. You should have 2 tier 1 pieces and 2 tier 2 pieces, 1 for each sleeve. And we are going to be attaching tier 1 to the bodice and tier 2 to tier 1. To start off, we are going to take our tier 2 piece and turn one long edge under towards the wrong side of the fabric by 1/4 inch and press well with your iron. Repeat that over on your other tier 2 piece. Now on all of your tier 1 and tier 2 rectangles, you're going to be doing your parallel gathering stitches across one long edge. For tier 2, it's going to be the edge that you didn't just fold. So remember, these are very similar, pretty much the same as how we did our bodice. You're going to do 2 parallel lines of stitching. At the beginning, you back stitch. At the end, you do not. You just leave a tail of like 6 inches of thread. And we're going to do the first line of stitching about 1/8 of an inch away from the raw edge, second one 1/4 inch away, and you're using your longest stitch length on your sewing machine. Here's what those lines of stitching look like. Now we're going to start by attaching our tier 2 to our tier 1. So I'm going to turn tier 1 with right sides facing up, and I'm going to Put tier 2, right sides facing with it. We're going to be lining up the raw edges that eventually are going to be attached to each other. And so that is our unstitched edge of tier 1 and our stitched edge of tier 2. I'm going to do a very similar method to how I gathered in the bodice using my pinning to the ironing board method. Grabbing those top 2 threads, pulling and pushing the fabric along the threads until our tier 2 is the same length as our tier 1 raw edge. Once I've got the length and tension correct, I place my anchor pin and just secure by doing a figure 8 around it with my thread. Now I have my hands free. I can come in and disperse my ruffles evenly here. Once I like where they're at, come in with the iron and press, 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 pin every few inches. Then we'll take this over to our sewing machine and stitch across with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at each end. Make sure you remember to change your stitch length back to normal. After you've stitched across, go ahead and trim this seam allowance down to 1/4 inch, and then to protect it, either use your serger or a zigzag stitch. Here's what that seam looks like serged. Now to make it look nice and clean and crisp, we're going to turn everything over so the right side is facing up, and we're going to press that seam allowance we just made up towards tier 1. Use your iron and your fingers, sort of roll the seam allowance in that direction. Then we'll take this over to our sewing machine and we'll do a top stitch 1/8 of an inch away from that seam line there and back stitch at each end. Here's what that stitch looks like when it's finished. Now you can repeat all of these steps if you haven't yet. Do those on your other sleeve. And then we can go ahead and attach our bell sleeve extensions here to our bodice. So we're going to do the exact same method we just did to attach tier 2 to tier 1. We're going to do all that exact same gathering up here. So right sides facing, tier 1 onto the sleeve part of our bodice, and we are just going to gather up those stitches, pin, stitch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, serge or protect your stitch with a zigzag stitch. Then we're going to turn that seam allowance back up towards the sleeve hem. All right, I'll put it on fast mode. All right, here's how that seam looks finished attached to the bodice and with our tier 1 and tier 2. We've only just turned the bottom hem of the sleeve under by a 1/4 inch for now. We're going to return to this after we do our underarm and side seams. All right, let's do that next. Now, no matter the sleeve style or the color you're doing on your garment, we're all going to come back to doing our underarm and bodice side seams right now. So our very first step is to flip our garment over to the wrong side. One quick step before we do our underarm and side seams, we want to turn our bodice hem under by 1/4 inch. Press really well with your iron. You're going to do this for both your bodice front and your bodice back. We'll return to this bottom hem at the very end, but for now we're just going to leave it and we're going to focus on our underarm and bodice side seam here. This is all going to be one seam, but it is technically continuous throughout your underarm and the side of your bodice. So we want to position our garment so that the bodice right sides are facing each other, wrong side is facing you, and you're going to line up any of your sleeve hems that you've got here. So, you know, we all did different sleeve finishes, but what's most important is that you line up 3 points. You line up the hem of your sleeve, or if you're doing double ruffle, you might have 2 hems that you need to line up. The spot where your short sleeve ends or your sleeve attachment begins, make sure you line those up. And you want to line up this bottom hem here of the bodice that we just turned under by a 1/4 inch. So I like to start at those 3 points, get a pin in each of them, and then work my way all the way around this curve, and then we'll take it over to our sewing machine and stitch with 1/2 inch seam allowance, running all the way from the hem of the bodice to the hem of your sleeve. Repeat this over on the other side as well. After you've stitched your underarm and side seam, go ahead and trim this up to a 1/4 inch, either with your scissors or over at your serger. We're gonna do a protective seam finish, however you're doing it today, serger, zigzag, faux overlock, whatever you've got. Here's what that looks like finished. Now we're going to move on to finish our hems, so our sleeve hems and our bodice hem. Let's start with the bodice hem because we all have the same bodice hem. So I'm going to just start by turning this bottom hem under by another 1/4 inch. If you remember, we already have turned it under 1/4 inch previously. If for some reason you lost that turn under or forgot about it or missed it, then you're just going to do a double turn under here towards the wrong side. And for the rest of us, we're just doing our second turn of the 1/4 inch hem, pressing it with your iron as you go all the way around. Then we're going to take this over to our sewing machine, and we are going to stitch just 1/8 inch or as close as you can possibly get to that inner folded edge all the way around. I like to start and stop this stitch over at a side seam because that's usually less visible for all of the kind of back stitching that you might notice. You don't want that on the front. Here's how that seam looks finished on the wrong side of the fabric and on the right side. Now it's time for us to do our very last step, which is to finish our sleeve hem. There are different sleeve hem finishing techniques here for the different variations of sleeves. So let's start with the very first, most simplest sleeve hem, and that is our short sleeve 3/4 length or full length sleeve. All you're going to do is to turn that bottom hem under by another 3/4 inch. You started with a 1/4 inch turn, now we're adding a 3/4 inch turn toward the wrong side of the sleeve. Press well with your iron. You can pin all the way around if you'd like to. And then we're going to take it over to our sewing machine, and we are going to stitch just 1/8 of an inch or as close as you can get to that inner fold all the way around. I like to start and stop this line of stitching near the underarm seam. That way the back stitching is a little more hidden from view. Here's what that seam looks like finished from the right side and the wrong side. Woohoo! You did it! Alright, in this section of the video, I'm showing you how to finish the sleeve hem of the ruffle, double ruffle, and bell flare sleeves. We all ended our sleeves with a 1/4 inch turn toward the wrong side of the fabric. We are just going to repeat that. We are going to turn it again about a 1/4 inch toward the wrong side of the fabric, press with our iron. Then we'll take this over to our sewing machine, and we're going to stitch all the way around about 1/8 inch or as close as you can get to that inner fold line, back stitching at each end. And I always recommend back stitching here like at your underarm seam. That way it's a little bit more hidden from view. Here's what that sleeve hem looks like finished from the wrong side and from the right side. Now repeat this over on your other sleeve hem and you're all finished. In this section of the video, I'm showing how to finish the sleeve hem of the bishop sleeve. So far we had our bishop sleeve hem binding already attached to our sleeve, and we had it folded, the raw edge folded down to meet the raw edge of our sleeve. They're kind of meeting in the middle with a bunch of raw edges having a party here in the center. Now, if by chance you accidentally missed that when you did your underarm and it came unfolded, just fold it at this point, no big deal. All right, so our final step here is going to be to fold one last time our hem binding by about a 1/2 inch toward the wrong side of the garment so that it encases and holds all of that messy seam allowance inside. And you come around with your iron. We're hoping that that inner folded edge will cover up that seam line that you see inside. Work all the way around. And then we'll take this over to our sewing machine and we'll stitch 1/8 inch away from that inner folded edge, back stitching at each end. You're gonna go all the way around. I usually recommend that you do your back stitching here at the underarm seam area. That way it's less visible on the finished garment. Here's how that seam looks finished on the right side and on the wrong side. And that's it, you're finished.